place to start would just be with a definition of yoga, because it's meant so many things to so many people throughout time and now, that starting with some definition of what we're talking about for the purposes of the conversation seems like a good place to start.
My view is very simple and very deep. It's the essence, and I don't have another view. There are so many external tributaries that now, not tributaries, streams that come from the idea of yoga, but for me it is always and is always about divine union. It's always about that which is within each human being that makes them capable of living a divine life while embodied. So it is always about the human joining with the divine. And the word for yoga is what I hold, which is union. And people feel that desire to different degrees and different depths. So a person can enter the stream of what is currently available as pathways to that union at various levels of intensity and commitment and interest. And yeah, they can enter it wherever they are. But the goal is always union. And I believe that as one enters the path, progressively and over a period of time, the heart opens to know that that's possible. In the beginning, I think many people who enter yoga, become yoga practitioners, even teachers, they don't have that as a goal, maybe abstractly, but not personally, because they don't know it's possible. So the path leads to the knowledge that it's the goal and also that it's possible. And then that becomes the single central purpose and definition of what yoga is.
You're describing in what you just said, you described a state of being and a movement towards that state of being, and also talked about like practices that people do or engage in when they're, thinking that they're doing yoga. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about those three things: the state of being and the movement towards it, and then these, like, the practices, that it isn't just modern. I mean, people throughout time have talked about practices supporting their movement towards yoga.
The question is, what is a state of being? Even those words are abstract for most people, including people interested in yoga. What is a state of being? Is it being aware of yourself? Is it having an intention? Is it who you are, whether you know it or not? What is a state of being? So I would say, to link it with what I said earlier, that a person perceives their identity at a certain level of engagement with their interest in the divine. And I say interest because interest is variable. It's variable in intensity, it's variable in breadth. And so identity, who you think you are, has some relationship to a state of being, but it's not equal. So that's the complexity of it. Who you think you are and who you are two different things very often. And I would say that that identity moves closer to the beingness of who you actually are, the more self-awareness grows. And then when that convergence happens, let's say, I think it could happen through time alone, through spiritual evolution. It's certainly what people direct their efforts to in terms of yoga practice, the increased state of awareness. But being is who you actually are. And that's a road to travel to know that, so that you come to the place where you know that you are an embodiment of the divine. So it's both the journey and the goal, both the journey and the goal. And How much one knows that that's what one is moving towards, that's very variable. People have to enter these things, these pathways, from the place that they believe is reality, including what they believe about themselves. What is my reality? So it could go for a very long time that somebody has an idea of their identity, but not of their being, and therefore doesn't really know what's possible at the other end as the goal. They may hear the words, they may have the concepts, but it requires the maturation of the identity to know more about who you are. And then who you are becomes the platform, the foundation for that union, which is the goal. But it's a complex thing to talk about a state of being. Even that word is confusing to lots of people.
I really like how you say it's both the journey and the goal, because so much of the teachings and the practices, in my experience, have been centered around being present. And that if I just have this goal of something that's somewhere out there, away from here and now, it somehow like leaves out my current embodiment or my current even struggles as a human. So there's something about, I don't know, maybe there's something more you can say about the importance of like the moment by moment present journey of seeking, well, of residing in our being so that we may seek that unity with the divine. I'm not sure if I'm articulating this well.
What I used as words, identity and being. I find that there's a very big gap often between the identity, who one thinks one is, and who one actually is. But in order to close the gap, what you're saying is entirely true. There has to be a commitment to the deepening of self-awareness so that some of the habitual words and thoughts you have about who you are leave. They're old concepts, and something new can take their place. And this gets us into the question of practice and experience and thought. Everything, all these big words, you know. Yeah. A thought is not an experience. An experience is something that registers in your body mind, not in your mind, but in your body mind and in your deeper level of intuition and soul and heart. So I have the awareness from many conversations about this, that many people long for the experience of something, and they're at the level of concept about something. So that's not bad. It's just a transition that one has to go through. And it's important to not mix up the two. A thought about something is not the experience of something. So when you talk about awareness or being present, or I spoke of it as the journey, the question of honesty comes up, in my view, about how honest can a person be to know where they actually are in their own development, what they have to learn, what they have to heal, and what is not real yet is just a spiritual concept. If one approaches life like that, to be exactly at the stage that you're at and not try to be spiritually correct or not try to move your self identity forward just by using the words, then you're in a good place. If you are aware of what you need to learn and where you are between thought and experience, then the divine has all the room in the world to move into the next step of what you need to learn. But it depends, and there's I don't know what to call it, a pitfall, I guess, that people fall into the desire to believe that the words are reality and that the concept is experience, which is often not the case, that there has to be more healing on the level of self-awareness before the divine can move into that place and show itself more clearly. Everybody wants that, but what you're talking about is being present in a very authentic way to where one is and what one is dealing with, which is the journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This issue about thought and experience covers a lot of territory about the mistakes that can get made because of the intention to become something and the pressure of the ego to make that happen, so that one moves into thinking that, well, I know what this is supposed to mean, so therefore I am that. No, it doesn't work like that. And there needs to be humility so that one is willing to know, I'm right here, and here's a good place to be, because this is the truth that unfolds into greater truth.
You're talking about humility now, and in a moment ago you used the word commitment. And a word that's often used in association with yoga that's similar but definitely not the same is discipline. And I wonder what your feeling is about that word, discipline, in relation to this.
Well, there are different perspectives that one can hold about that. What I believe is that every person is their own path. And what that means is that the path forward has to be determined from within. If that's the case, and there's a resonance, a resonant frequency, a vibrational feeling of rightness to move forward in a certain direction, then everything works well. Then discipline becomes linked with the energy of the heart and with the inner pathway that's projecting some sort of outer direction, and everything works well. And discipline is the way to practice something that feels like it's taking you someplace. But the dilemma of that word discipline is that people can apply it without balance, apply it in the sense of obedience, apply it in the sense of action that's disconnected from the heart. And then one travels as far as you can in that direction and may or may not come up with fruitful results, may or may not. Because if something is followed as a matter of an external dictate rather than an internal sense of rightness, then it has limitations in terms of its integration with the whole of who one is. So I would say about discipline that it's important. It's important not to give up. It's important to have regularity of something you commit yourself to. It's important to have an intensity of commitment. But all of that has to register in the heart as the inner right way, as the inner sense of rightness, or else one is performing outer actions that may or may not be fruitful. And I go back to the first statement. Everyone is their own path.
In my own process, I've had this question ongoing for a long time, not really an articulate question, but this kind of inquiry about concentration in the same sort of way. And like sitting this morning in meditation, when you were inviting us to be present in the moment, and you invite us to keep coming back to our being in this moment, breathing. There's this sense I have of the value of concentration, of being able to stay and not go. And then, I think of it as kind of like a muscle that needs practice to build and develop. But then I look at you and I know that there's no muscle or there's no effort in your presentness. And so is it that the effort and the muscle building of concentration is useful up to a point and then it just falls away, or is it not useful at all, or is there a more nuanced?
You're asking me to explain how concentration without effort takes place. And if it's effortful, is that useful? I think that we're talking about spiritual development, and that concentration with effort is necessary during a certain portion of one's development, because the gravitational pull, my words, gravitational pull towards the divine has to get stronger. The gravitational pull is something that's done through a combined joining of the divine and the human in the process of surrender. It's a pull. It's not, you don't do gravity. You feel gravity. You feel pulled towards something. So in the earlier stages of this gravitational pull or this joining, the concentration is needed so that you can even feel that there's a pull going on. So you could feel, here's the direction to follow, and not this direction, and this direction, and 10 other competing priorities. But this is about spirituality and the intensity with which one lives a spiritual life. That gravitational pull can be at different degrees of intensity, and is for many lifetimes. So the concentration with effort is needed to say to yourself, no, I'm not going there, and I'm not going there, I'm staying with this. And the there that is pulling in a different direction is history. Your history before this gravitational pull towards the divine became so strong pulls you in all those directions. So it's not to be judged. It's just that the legacy of past history is creating that counterpoint or counter direction. So that's concentration with effort. It's a necessary part of the journey for most people, I believe, to allow the gravitational pull towards the divine to get stronger. What happens eventually is that there's no more effort because there's nothing else that pulls. If nothing else pulls you but the divine, because yourself is completely surrendered to that pull, then nothing else pulls you and there's no effort. The gravitational pull becomes a seamless joining of a current of energy that's totally focused on that divine human partnership, and there's no pull. So then what you see is no effort, no counter pull, no effort, because one is totally focused on that. And that's the desire, maybe for many people, but the level of surrender to that pull has to get stronger. And when it gets stronger, then the effort leaves.
There's something I want to ask about, all life is yoga and living yoga, and the thoughts perhaps, or the trappings of beliefs or societal pressures that I know keep me and many others, like I've had many people say to me, I'd love to give my life to God the way you're doing, but I'm working a computer job full time and I'm raising kids. And I even notice in my own life that there's only one thing that I'm here for. And it is that two-way pull.
Joining.
Yeah. And yet I'm just very aware. I'm wondering if you can speak to something about that it feels like a difficulty of staying true and real when there's like societal pressures of raising children and working jobs and meeting, social commitments and relationships. That, that interplay of living yoga, and all life is yoga.
Darling, you are speaking of history. You are speaking of humanity's consciousness in the past. I don't live in that past. I live in the future, and the present is connected with the future in its present transformational stage and in its aspiration. The past has to do with the separation into compartments of what you're calling society and what we call spirituality and what we call business and what we call transcendence and what we call practicality and what we call spirituality. All these compartments are based on the secularization of consciousness. All of them are based on the same evolutionary stream, which was necessary in order to create individualization within the Earth's evolutionary stream. The individualization process required a centering in the separate self that could make choices and that could determine what life was and that knew itself in its own physical identity. All of what we know as the ego self isn't a mistake. It's not a bad thing. It happened because of the purpose of creation. But at the same time, the secularization of consciousness took place. That's the past history. That is not my reality. And that is not the reality of the future. How many years it will take, I don't know, but I know it's happening now. This movement towards re-sanctification. And what that means is that you don't separate out into child rearing, societal pressures, computer jobs, business, earning an income, going to the store, like that. You don't separate out activities because the presence of the reality of the divine becomes the primary, central reality of life. And it's very hard to conceive of that right now because what we see of that on the world stage is generally politicized. It's generally the radical ideas and the evangelical affirmations of a certain religious and political group that claims that God is the center of life. And I'm sure there are some people who feel that, but there are a lot of people who use ideology to substitute for spirituality. Ideology is not spirituality. What I'm talking about is different. What I'm talking about is the re-sanctification of human consciousness so that the reality of the divine becomes the primary center of child rearing, of working, of where you go to work, of what your relationships are about. And there's no longer a competition between compartments. And because I can't give you a timeline, although I do feel it's happening now in its beginnings, people say, oh, yes, that would be very nice, but that's going to take 1,000 years. No, that's not the case. What it's going to take is a vibrational shift in our consciousness, which is already happening. So you're speaking of the pressure that's actual and real and what people feel. And I'm talking about where humanity is going. And the question for each being, including you, is, are you a way shower? Are you a way shower? To be a way shower is to run counter to the current that's based on the past and to bring in the currents that's based on the future. It's to identify the divine as central to every aspect of experience rather than allowing for the premise that life has to be compartmentalized. You can't expect people to know how to do that until it becomes obvious to their consciousness that the central reality of reality is the divine. the central aspect of creation, is the creator of creation. Whether you think of that as internal or external, doesn't matter. The divine is the basis for life. So the re-sanctification of that consciousness has not happened so that you would hear, oh yes, that's the way we're meant to live, but I can't do it. Well, that's what you do here. That's the way we're meant to live, but I can't do it. To something else that says this has to happen because it's the only way. It is the only way.
I have a question related to that, GurujiMa, which is around, I mean, I think it's a common human experience to think of doing what you're saying as involving giving something up that I'm attached to. So it's not just that I have a computer job and I have my other things. I mean, that's one level of it, but another level is that would require me giving something up that I don't want to give up.
Can you give me an example?
Well, it really comes now back to surrender and attachment and all that.
I was thinking about unconsciousness. I don't want to give up unconsciousness. I don't want to have to be too responsible. I don't want to give up leisure time or checking out, or, you know, it's in some ways connected to the question about discipline and the perception of a split life where there's my relaxed self and my coping mechanisms, and then there's my serious spiritual self, and these two are in conflict with each other.
Many people are accustomed to living on the surface of themselves, making decisions according to the body's needs or what feels better in the moment. And that leeway to act in ways that are not socially destructive are often personally destructive. It's the reason people justify alcohol drinking and the use of substances. I'm not doing it that much. I'm not really even talking about addiction here. Just the use of time in order to reduce stress and the freedom to make a choice about how and when to do that. That's the same thing I was speaking of when I said about we're talking about the past history. This is the surface self that wants to have the freedom of choice of when to relax and when to pay attention to something that requires work. And for many people in that frame of reference, spirituality is a lot of work. So that's a perspective that's historical, ego-centered, based on a definition of freedom that's no longer the definition that I hold and that you need to hold. It's a definition of freedom based on personal choice, but personal choice includes doing things that are not constructive, doing things that are destructive, doing things that are reducing one's growth, reducing one's capacity to become more fulfilled. It doesn't feel that way in the moment because the idea, for example, of eating sweets, something that's a pastime for, billions of people eating sweets as comfort food, or smoking. I don't know how many people are still smoking, but smoking cigarettes or alcohol in modest amounts, it's all thought of in the same way. To be harmless pastimes to relieve stress, pressure, something like that. But that's all based on a definition of the surface self and what freedom is. When you actually have an experience of your own reality connected with divine reality, that definition no longer holds. And those beings, which are millions of people, who have not had that experience to a sufficient degree, are still operating on that level of what is freedom and what do I have to give up. But I tell you, and have said many times, surrender is the path to freedom. Now, who thinks that? Certainly in Western culture, people don't get up and cheer about surrender is the path to freedom, but it is, because it leads to the greater fulfillment, the greater expression of your deeper self. So really there are two questions, not only how to answer that question about what about the misgivings or reluctance of people who don't want to give up something, or who don't want to work harder at being conscious, or who don't want to let go of a certain aspect of their identity. What about those people? And my answer to that is what I said. We're talking about past history. And then the other part of the answer is, what does it take for people to have a new experience of the self so that it convinces them, you, anybody, that there's greater freedom in that? There's magnificent freedom in that. What does it take for that? And I think that many people are disillusioned with that possibility, that that's actually a new definition of freedom. Many people are still pulled to the lesser definition, which is I am free to do whatever I want, whenever I want it. So you see, that's again the distinction between where human consciousness has been and what's possible. One has to have the experience of something else in order to know that greater freedom is possible.
You know, in some of the, maybe it's more New Age Tantra, or just certain tantric philosophy, whether it's accurate or a twist on it, there's a lot of thought and practice that, well, everything is God and everything is divinized. So everything I do is being with God. So I can drink alcohol because it's part of God. I can do, you know, it's that, like, I don't have to have a separate practice or do anything separate, because everything I do is God and with God through this, I don't, what would you even call it? Is it Neo Tantra? Is it not real? Or
what you're talking about is a very specific stream of, in the kind of collective yoga, modern yoga consciousness. But, yeah,
right. And okay, exactly.
I wouldn't call it anything.
Okay, so that's, thank you for defining that, because that's important. There is a stream in modern yoga that will use the word tantra, but it's not probably rooted in anything. I don't know, whatever. I'm gonna stop with my. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it has confused me. I've looked at this and thought about it, like, is this true? Is this really happening? Or what's my blockage? How come I don't feel God in all these regular activities? I mean, I do sometimes, but what's going on with that stream, that voice, that consciousness that says, well, everything is divine, so everything I do, whatever I'm doing, is with God, and I can do anything for that matter.
I have such funny reactions to things sometimes. I feel tears in myself, and it's because what you're asking me leads me to another poignant feeling I have about human consciousness. It comes down to the question about what is non-duality and whether there is such a thing as right and wrong. And the justification on the level you're speaking about is that because everything is divine, non-dual, then there is no right and wrong. I have heard that so many times. And it's so poignant to me that there's a level distortion about how to speak, and it's based on the problem of human language, about at what level are we speaking about there is no right and wrong. I see that, and I don't know that there is a vocabulary yet in which to speak about this, but I'll do the best I can. Non-duality exists on the level of the primary unity of the divine. The primary unity of divine being includes absolutely everything. So if it includes absolutely everything, you can't take out a part and say this is wrong because it's included in the absolutely everything. And there's nothing within that unity, which is God, which is the divine, that is wrong. It's all inclusive, but it doesn't have a negative spin on it, like this part is wrong. That's a level. But the biggest, maybe this is why I feel tears, because the biggest dichotomy that I perceive that human beings are struggling with who are dedicated spiritually is the dichotomy of who God is between being and becoming. That split has been irreconcilable for millennia, being and becoming. And if you take non-duality without the other half, if you take being without becoming or becoming without being, you get half of something because they are polarizations within the concept of the divine that are actually not separable, but they in human culture are separable. So non-duality on the level of primary being is applicable. There's no right and wrong. Non-duality on the level of the manifested creation is not that. It is not that, because the experience of all of creation is to become more of the source that is the creator, is to be manifest more and more of God. And to manifest more and more of God, there is a value that comes into play about what helps manifest more and more of God, what creates greater perfection into a greater wholeness, greater capacity to manifest, and what detracts from that, what moves you towards the greater truth of that primary unity, and what takes you away from it. This dichotomy, I feel, is so pervasive that people don't even talk about it. And oddly enough, which is not odd really, but I've told you before that I haven't read very much at all of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother's writings, some, but not a lot. But I feel so joined with them in relation to the movement of being into becoming. I feel so joined with that understanding of what human beings are meant to become, and all of creation. We're just talking about the human. If you look at that movement towards greater wholeness and perfection, then you can't say that everything is equal. It's not equal. There are things that promote that and things that are illusions that take you away from that movement towards greater becomingness. If you feel that there's nothing you have to become because you're already there, which is another postulate of some people, you don't have to become anything, you're already there, then you go into this place of defining everything's all right. But that eliminates something that's a very important aspect of creation, which is the becomingness of all that is into the manifestation of greater wholeness. So on one level, anything's okay if you derive it from the primary unity, but the primary unity doesn't have evil in it, that in a separated way. And on this level, evil exists in a separated way. So it's a level confusion about how to define non-duality. And then there's the dichotomy I mentioned. I'm sorry that it's such a big thing, but it is, that dichotomy between being and becoming captures the reason that religious wars have been fought for thousands of years and people have killed each other for thousands of years because of this very distinction.
I mean, this is huge. We could spend the next month talking just about.
At least 10 years.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, I tell you sometimes, or at least I think I have, how I am in love with the Upanishads. I'm in love with the audiobook of the Upanishads, I should say, because I've only listened to that. But I'm always touched when the disciples come to the master and they tell him where they are in their own development about what they think reality is. And the master says, you have to come back for another 30 years and then then we'll review the subject again. So then they go back for 30 more years and they study with him and they learn more about what reality is. Then they leave again, they come back 30 years later. So in one of the stories about this, one of the disciples had studied with the master for, well over 100 years in order to acquire an understanding of what reality was. It's just the time frame that I find so touching.
Well, since we have a few minutes left, there's one other thread from the last thing that you spoke about that I would like to follow up on, and that's I thought when you said that you were feeling tears, what you were going to say was about people's cynicism, that they don't believe that more is possible, and so they say, yeah, I'm already with God, what's the problem? And that there's a kind of there's something to me like poignant about the person who has written off the experience of union with the divine and said, well, this is as good as it gets, so I'm just going to be happy with this, which is different from I accept this moment fully as it is. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that differentiation between accepting reality as it is. And you said this morning, I choose to be, I don't know exactly what you said, but I felt like I choose to be in this moment. I choose to be here. As myself. And the difference between that and this is I don't know, like there is no possibility of further becoming.
Yeah, I don't have tears about that, Matthew. I feel joy about that. I feel joy because the message of the soul, the divine message, is coming to more people from within. The divine message about seeking more of what's possible. And there is joy in that because I know that that's the point that we're at now, even though it doesn't look that way. The point of more people knowing that more of life is possible is where we are. The counterpoint to that is the disillusionment and the gravitation towards the past. I spoke about gravitational pulls, but we're seeing that on the level of purification on a collective or global level today, that wherever you have the movement forward into greater awakening, greater possibility, and I see that a lot, you also have a pull, not necessarily within the same individual, but on a collective level towards cynicism, disillusionment, a feeling of mistrust, a sense that war is inevitable, a sense of we have to protect our boundaries. The opposite of unity is also taking place on the level of energetic pulls. So when I hear somebody who feels that this is all that's possible, I look for the opportunity to create an experience where that's clearly not true. I don't know in what context you run into that kind of comment, but the world is full of disappointed idealists, and a coping mechanism for disappointed idealism is cynicism. Mm-hmm. So when I meet cynicism, unless it's a very virulent kind of brandishing it and wanting everybody else to join it, I see that. I see a person longing for something else. I don't know the context you're meeting people in, but I do feel that those pulls in the two directions of the future and the past define a lot of what's going on the world stage. And so the feelings that correspond to that among people are what I'm saying. The movement towards greater hope, greater possibility, a greater sense of wanting to experience unity with other beings and with the earth, and the opposite, which is greater fear, greater mistrust, a sense of human limitation, a sense of, we have to protect our own and everybody else take care of themselves. Where have we seen that before in the last 4 years? It's those two forces, but for me, the one that's moving into the future is the one that's the foundation of everything else. And the rest is purification, manifested into the holding on to this other point of view.